Well, welcome to today's Plunkett webinar on Pope Francis' bioethical and moral philosophical legacy. My name's Xavier Symons, and I'm Director of the Plunkett Centre for Ethics at the Australian Catholic University. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we're a joint initiative of ACU and several participating partner organisations in the Catholic health and aged care sector. And I have the happy task today of introducing our speakers and moderating Q&A, and very fortunately got out of the difficult business of actually saying anything too substantial. Maybe I'll contribute in Q&A, we'll see. But I would like to just start, though, by providing a brief introduction for this webinar and talk a little bit about Pope Francis's bioethical and social writings, just to sketch the scene. Some of you joining us today would have a good knowledge of the documents published during Pope Francis's pontificate. Some of you may be less familiar with his work, and I'll try and just give you a little bit of an overview in the next few minutes. So Pope Francis is probably best known for his humble and frugal lifestyle and his spontaneity and compassion. Maybe some more memorable moments from his pontificate, or memorable images, we might say, include him washing the feet of prison inmates during Holy Thursday Mass, or embracing and kissing a man with severe facial deformities during a papal audience. Perhaps also one of the more haunting images of his pontificate was when the Pope said benediction in St. Peter's Square in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, and St. Peter's Square, which is usually full with people, was entirely empty. And in fact, it was a rainy day, a dark, overcast, rainy day on that occasion. And there were these very haunting images of the Pope there alone in St. Peter's Square performing benediction. So I think that's maybe something that's stuck in all of our heads from his pontificate. But we should note as well that Pope Francis wrote a lot during his papacy and made major contributions to Catholic social thought on social and moral questions. His encyclical Laudato Si encouraged Catholics to see nature not as a tool to be exploited, but as God's creation, which should be treated with respect and contemplated with reverence. His apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, put the Catholic Church on a missionary footing and encouraged Catholics to radiate the joy of the gospel, while his encyclical Fratelli Tutti sought to explore the relationship and obligations of nations to each other through the lens of fraternal charity and brotherly concern. Pope Francis spoke often about bioethical issues, which will be the major focus of our discussion today. He was a strong critic of abortion and euthanasia, as well as commercial surrogacy and gender ideologies. To some extent, the document Dignitas Infinita, a document released by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, was a distillation of Pope Francis's statements on bioethical matters. Dignitas Infinita focused on contemporary threats to human dignity and represented a reassertion of Catholic teaching that human life possesses a surpassing dignity and which renders it worthy of respect at all stages of life and in all circumstances. And interestingly, Dignitas Infinita also tackled issues like social issues, I should say, like poverty, war, migration, trafficking, violence against women, sexual abuse, and so on. And in this way, I think the document reflected Pope Francis's broader approach of drawing connections between moral and bioethical issues and questions on the one hand, and on the other hand, matters of social justice. So kind of drew connections between moral questions, moral issues, and social questions, social issues, and tried to show that the way in which we respond in these different domains are in fact linked. And that brings me to a bit of a personal reflection. If I were to say what I found most insightful about Pope Francis's moral and social writings, it would be his emphasis on genuine conversion of heart as a precursor to addressing the great bioethical and social challenges of our time. At various points, Pope Francis noted that if our hearts are darkened and unresponsive to value in the world, then we will be unlikely to appreciate the dignity of life and transcendent character of the world, or to affect lasting social or political change on these issues. So conversely, if we orient our hearts so that we can fully appreciate value as it's present in the world, and above all, the dignity of human life, we will be much more effective at promoting respect for human life at its beginning and end, and also addressing social problems like widespread poverty, displacement of people due to war or political instability, and even environmental degradation. So this is what I take it means to resist, in Pope Francis's words, a throwaway culture. We need to treasure and value rather than exploit, end or abandon human life and God's creation. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to our speakers who will be offering their own reflections on Pope Francis's pontificate and writings. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bernadette Tobin. I'll introduce our three speakers now, and then we'll pass over to them. So Dr. Bernadette Tobin is an associate professor within the Plunkett Centre for Ethics at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, an ACU, and reader in philosophy at ACU. She has been a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life since 2018, and she was the founding director of the Plunkett Centre. Dr. Michael Wee is an associate research fellow of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, a Catholic research institute based in Oxford, where he is leading a project on advanced decision and ethical choices. He has been a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life since 2020 and is also a fellow of Wolfson College at the University of Oxford. Associate Professor Natasha Michael is a senior palliative care consultant and academic who has trained and worked internationally in palliative care. She is an associate professor at the Institute of Health Research at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and an adjunct professor at Monash University. She has led the development of palliative care services in the public and private sectors across metropolitan and regional settings, and held senior teaching and research roles. So in today's session, our speakers are going to talk to us for roughly 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll close with roughly 20 minutes for questions. Please type your questions into the question box on Teams, and we'll hopefully be able to pose those questions to our panelists. Without further ado, I'll hand over first to Michael Wee, who will address us, followed by Bernadette and then Natasha. Thanks very much, Michael.
Great. Thank you very much, Xavier, and a very good afternoon to you, or good morning from where I am. It's 7 o'clock here in the UK, but I'm very, very pleased to give up a few hours of, or some time of extra sleep to join you for this great occasion. Just going to find my slides to share. I can get started straight away. All right. So once again, thanks very much, Xavier, for hosting me, for having the three of us at this panel discussion on bioethics and moral philosophy in the Pontificate of Pope Francis. And as the title of my slide already suggests, I'm going to be talking about the unity or the synthesis of moral teaching and Catholic social teaching that I believe was the hallmark of Pope Francis's teachings on the moral life during his time as Pope. So what can we say, first of all, as the context, as a very important context to Pope Francis' bioethical legacy? I think it's fair to say, first of all, that in the Catholic intellectual tradition and in general Catholic catechesis in parishes for RCIA, etc., we tend to treat the Catholic Church's moral teaching and her social teaching as separate. Added to that, I've often noticed this dangerous tendency among some people to treat one of them as mandatory, moral teaching, especially when it comes to absolute matters of morality, of which the Church has quite a few, and to treat the other one, social teaching, as optional. Now, it is true that it is characteristic of Catholic social teaching to require what we often call a prudential judgment on the basis of circumstances, right? So prudential judgment is essentially about applying moral principles to the particulars of circumstances, and those particulars, as we know, in life are messy, can change very quickly, and they do change almost all the time. So it is characteristic, true enough, of social teaching to often consist in prudential judgments. And it's not a mechanical process of application either. But it does not mean that the established principles of Catholic social teaching are somehow, optional for us Catholics, or that the Church cannot teach authoritatively on prudential judgments when she wishes to. She doesn't teach authoritatively all the time. Just because the Pope makes a particular comment that is a prudential judgment doesn't make it, a teaching of the magisterium, but sometimes it can be. So with that in mind, I want to suggest that one of the principal contributions of Pope Francis to the Catholic Church's moral teachings, and in particular bioethical teaching, was the way he sought to bridge this divide, to show that the Church's moral teaching and social teaching are continuous from one another. And crucially, this is the bit that some people, more than others, find difficult to accept or understand, that moral teaching on its own is insufficient. Insufficient from the point of view of the Church's and the Pope's mission, and insufficient for all our lives. So quite early on in his pontificate, we already saw something of a quote unquote warning sign, if you like, and I mean that in a thoroughly positive way, that this was going to be, this synthesis was going to be the hallmark of his pontificate. And this is Pope Francis speaking to the, I believe it was the first session of the Extraordinary Synod on the Family in 2014, where he warned against the, quote, temptation to hostile inflexibility, that is, wanting to close oneself within the written word, the letter, and not allowing oneself to be surprised by God, by the God of surprises, the Spirit, within the law, within the certitude of what we know and not of what we still need to learn and to achieve. So I think one of the big critiques Pope Francis made was people who think that it is sufficient to have the commandments. And I think he would say time and again, directly or indirectly, it is not sufficient. Now, interestingly enough, while preparing for this talk, this article in First Things came out just a few days ago by Bishop Robert Barron, who himself also said, focusing on slightly different things from my talk today, but he also said a novelty of Francis's social doctrine was the extrapolation from individual ethics to the ethical obligations that should obtain among and between nations. So I'm going to talk you through a few examples of where I think Pope Francis was certainly at his best in trying to synthesize these two traditions of the Church's teaching, the moral and the social, to try and go beyond that hostile inflexibility, that certitude of simply focusing on the law, on the written word, and what that means for bioethics today. Now, I have to say that contrary to many of the late Pope's critics, I don't think personally that Pope Francis had any particular agenda to change the Church's doctrines. He wanted to ensure that the Church was not, boxed in by the word alone, that the Church explored what the application of moral teaching to the messiness of reality looked like. Sometimes this meant exploring pastoral solutions that were never countenanced before, and this is where Pope Francis got the most criticism. But at other times, in fact, it meant the Pope doubling down on the Church's critique of the modern world, and this was far less appreciated by many. Prudential judgments, as I've just mentioned, they are difficult because they are only valid in relation to the circumstances. Perhaps there were prudential judgments that were too imprecise in specifying their circumstances, and if we have time, we can discuss some of those. But I'm going to start by discussing just two, for me, representative examples of where Pope Francis was at his best in what I call this daring synthesis. But yes, forgive me, just a brief background. As some of you may know, Catholic social teaching, whereas moral teaching, as we all know, tends to focus on individual ethics, as Bishop Barron was suggesting, on the individual person, particular actions, especially things which are absolutely excluded from the moral life. The social teaching of the Church focuses on this idea of the common good, which is simply the social and community dimension of the moral good. It talks about aiming at the social conditions which allow people as groups and as individuals to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And I just want to make this brief point that the church's social teaching is quite often, it confounds people on both the left and the right of the political spectrum, because it's not just, kind of Catholic version of Pareto optimality. It's not just about the social or community aspect. It's also founded on the intrinsic and inviolable dignity of every human being. Both left and right, I believe, have their blind spots in relation to this. And here you can see, I won't read it out, just a quote from Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti, which, like all the popes before him, shows that recognition of the dignity of the human person as the foundation of this teaching, this pivot towards the social and community dimension of the moral good. So that's just to give some further context. But moving swiftly along. So in 2019, this is a picture of my wife and me with our son, then a baby. And we met the Pope in 2019 in the context of a conference organized by the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life. And that conference was entitled, and you'll see at the bottom of the slide, Yes to Life, taking care of the precious gift of life in its frailty. Now, this conference was a very special occasion, and I thought was a kind offered us a glimpse into the way Pope Francis was beginning to frame or reframe many familiar moral issues and moral teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, this was a conference about neonatal care, especially care for babies who were born with what we call life-limiting conditions, who might live for just a few days, a few minutes, a few hours, if you're lucky, a few weeks, and how parents respond to that. It was not a conference about abortion, even though the question or the topic of abortion came up, on the side of some of the issues about palliative and medical care offered to such babies and to their mothers. And when Pope Francis addressed us on the last day, early on in his address, he spoke about the wondrous nature of pregnancy. And really, I've never heard a Pope speak about this topic of beginning of life ethics in this way. He spoke about how when a woman discovers she is expecting a child, she immediately feels within her a deep sense of mystery. She is aware of a presence growing within her, one that pervades her whole being. Now, I think this is very significant for Catholic reflection on the ethics of the beginning of life, because so often in debates about abortion, for example, we're focused on the status of the embryo or the unborn child. We're thinking about the autonomy of women and mothers, but we don't pay enough attention to the character, the dignity of pregnancy itself. And in fact, the formation of this little community with its own common good, with its own conditions of flourishing. So I think that's a very important point that the Pope wanted to draw attention to. And then he moved on to express, I think, what is the first official papal support for the movement called the perinatal comfort care or perinatal hospice, essentially applying the best of our hospice care treatments and strategies, not to elderly people or even older children with terminal illness, but palliative care for babies who are born and who might not live for much longer. And the Pope spoke about unborn children as simply little patients. They are little patients who can be treated, who can be cared for in an integrated care process. And he said this together. We were in the hall in the Vatican together with one of the doctors in America who founded this perinatal hospice care movement. So if you look at these two passages together, I mean, they do not constitute an intellectual argument in support of the Church's teaching on abortion. Rather, they reframe it through the lens of care and our obligations in the context of care. Now, Pope Francis also said very striking things about end-of-life ethics. This came from a letter in 2017 he wrote to doctors meeting in Europe as part of the World Medical Association. And in this letter, Pope Francis expressed the Church's timeless objection to euthanasia, and he spoke about the importance of the patient being the one who helps make that moral judgment about whether treatment has become futile or disproportionate, and therefore becomes extraordinary means, as we call it in the Catholic tradition. And he stresses it is the patient who makes that judgment together with the medical professionals. But then he goes on to say, as you will see in the first paragraph, that evaluation is not easy to make in today's medical context, where the doctor-patient relationship has become increasingly fragmented. And he goes on in the next paragraph, for me, one of the most striking paragraphs in Pope Francis' writings about healthcare, where he talks about how that process of evaluation is also conditioned by the growing gap in healthcare possibilities resulting from the combination of technical and scientific capability and economic interests. He goes on to criticize the disparity in resources that essentially lead the rich or the more privileged to have at their disposal even more sophisticated and costly treatments, while of course those who are, sort of the rich get even more and the poor get even less. And we see this not just within societies, within nations, but also at the global level, particularly within between different countries, or even between different continents. So the sort of the individualistic aspect of looking at whether the treatment is proportionate or disproportionate for me actually has a much wider societal and global aspect of whether, why is treatment available or not available to me, is an important social question that has a moral, has moral import. And I won't read the whole thing, but this again shows a different side of the Church's teaching on end of life. This is not by Pope Francis himself, but by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, where he also expressed that importance of in care is not just about the technology, is not just about those societal and political conditions we talked about, but it's also sometimes simply about remaining, just as Our Lady and the disciples remained under the cross, which seems, as the Pope says, or as the congregation says, it seems something impotent or resigned. And yet remaining with somebody who is in their sick and in perhaps on their deathbed, just remaining with them, though we feel like we can do nothing more than just to be there. That is one of the most important things we can do in healthcare, just to be with that person, to provide that effective intimacy. So I find all of that very inspiring. It's a very interesting document, Samaritanus Bonus. I think it has sort of 5 chapters. It's only the last chapter that actually talks about sort of ethical principles for end-of-life care, and the rest of it is a rich reflection on the theology of care, again using care to reframe the obligations and the morality of what we think of as more individualistic matters of bioethics. Now, this is really my last bit of the talk. Those for me were some of the highlights of that synthesis of moral and social teaching. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, social teaching demands an attention to the particulars of circumstances in order to apply, long-standing and timeless moral principles. Now, what happens, however, in some cases of people who try to make that application is the difficulty of not specifying circumstances enough. Now, this isn't, magisterial teaching. This comes from the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission. But the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission released a document called A Vaccine for All. And now, most of it is not perhaps particularly controversial, but I want to draw your attention to 2 points they made. One about vaccine distribution between countries, and the other about the moral responsibility of undergoing vaccination. Now, I don't have time. My time is pretty much up to go into all the arguments about this. I'll just summarize by saying that, these are very, obviously, to say the least, contentious issues. And it's one thing to say, vaccination is a good thing, as I personally believe it is, and certainly in the context of COVID, and also to say it's important that all countries, and especially poorer countries who might have less purchasing power, should be given a fair share of the vaccine. Now, we can speak in these general terms, But once we get into the nitty-gritties of, well, exactly what order should we vaccinate? If we only have limited vaccines, do we vaccinate everybody from all countries equally slowly? Or do we actually, or is there some sense in actually vaccinating one country first and then another country, so that these countries can come out of lockdown, which is an awful kind of experience, very more quickly, rather than have everybody go through lockdown and come out of it slowly at the same time? How do we, in what sense is vaccination morally, obligatory, if it is at all? Is it just because, is it obligatory even when we find out, from the scientific studies that vaccines don't necessarily prevent transmission? What they do is they prevent serious illness. So it's not always about protecting other people through vaccination, but it's about protecting the healthcare system from collapsing through ICUs being overcrowded. So I think these are very intricate particular circumstances which demand more attention in order for that synthesis of moral and social teaching to be effective. And sometimes that was lacking in the documents produced under Pope Francis. So I will end there. We won't have to talk about this, but we can talk about that later. So thank you very much, Xavier, for having me, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other contributions. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Michael, for that very insightful presentation. We'll have opportunity to discuss the presentation with questions when we have Q&A at the end of this session, but I'm going to pass now to Bernadette, who will be speaking to us next.
Xavier, thank you very much. And it's lovely to be here, and a great honour to follow Michael. What a lovely presentation. I have just one slide which shows you what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak about Laudato Si, with some introductory remarks, the shape of the document, some objections to it with lines of reply, and then I'm going to conclude what I've got to say. So I will get rid of that and just come back to this. In November 2016, Pope Francis issued new statutes for the Pontifical Academy for Life. He directed that the Academy, originally founded in 1994 by John Paul II, widen the scope of its research and teaching so as to include not only the care of the dignity of the human person at different stages of life, but also the promotion of a quality of human life that integrates its material and spiritual value with a view to an authentic human ecology that helps to recover the original balance of creation between the human person and the entire universe. The year before, Francis had issued his encyclical letter Laudato Si, and in doing so he made a major contribution to a tradition of teaching which goes a long way back, well before the famous writings of Francis of Assisi in the 12th century. Francis of Assisi had called the earth our sister, our mother, who cries out because of the harms we've inflicted on her by an irresponsible use of the goods which God endowed her. Pope Francis added that the external deserts of the world are growing because the internal deserts of the human heart have become so vast. And so it shouldn't have been surprising that one of the people Francis appointed to the newly refreshed Pontifical Academy was an internationally known and widely respected agronomist, an expert in organic farming, someone who'd spent his life not only cultivating a farm in Bavaria, originally using industrial or conventional techniques, but also working for years in Haiti and other parts of the world with people who do not enjoy our Western prosperity. I will return to the man who introduced himself to me as just a farmer later. So let me say now a little bit about the shape of Laudato Si. It's got 6 chapters. In the first, what's happening in our common home? pollution, abuses of water, loss of biodiversity, cities unhealthy to live in, weak responses to global inequality, only sporadic acts of philanthropy, and perfunctory expressions of concern which view genuine efforts to introduce change as either nuisances or obstacles to be circumvented. In chapter 2, what does our tradition have to say about this? Well, because no form of science or wisdom should be rejected out of hand, a document that's addressed to all people of goodwill will include a focus on the convictions of believers. The Bible, old and new, is full of great narratives about the relationship of human beings to the rest of nature. But these narratives are misunderstood if they are used either to justify either a tyrannical anthropocentrism or an obsession with denying any preeminence to the human person. We're called to acknowledge creation as a gift of God, and that's an orientation which encourages in us a disposition of gratitude, without which there can be no deep and lasting solution to the ecological disaster and the need for global justice. What then are in chapter 3, the origins of this ecological crisis? One of them is a sound ethics, which is genuinely capable of setting limits and teaching self-restraint. An excessive anthropocentrism, which favours dominion rather than responsible stewardship. Social attitudes which fail to acknowledge the worth of a human embryo, the worth of a person with disabilities, or in which a concern for nature goes along with a justification for abortion. And crucially, there's a failure of the respect which faith owes to reason, a respect which would enable us to consider what constitutes legitimate interventions on nature. Fourthly, then, he goes on to the elements of a sound ecology. It begins with the interconnectedness between an environmental crisis and a social crisis. Not only do all of us need proper housing, good transport, pleasant living spaces, we also need respect for the moral law with its acknowledgement of human nature itself and the valuing of one's own body in its femininity and masculinity, a respect for the individual person and for the common good understood in the way that Michael set out, and together with that, accompanied by a sense of solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. In the 5th chapter, how might we achieve a sound ecology? Well, a global consensus is needed, a commitment to devising good processes which doesn't use lack of scientific certainty as a pretext for postponing cost-effective measures, a politics which is not subject to the dictates of an economy, and an economy which is not subject to efficiency-driven paradigms of technocracy. And finally, sixthly, how is that supported by education and spirituality? Well, not just by our learning new things, but also by our acquiring new habits. For there's a nobility in adopting little daily habits of, for example, wearing warmer clothes rather than turning up the heating. And we need to develop an ecological spirituality which avoids both ridiculing concern for the environment and adopting a passivity with respect to changing one's habits. Well, when Laudato Si was published, it attracted worldwide interest, and not just from people who shared the Pope's religious convictions. Indeed, some who generally dismiss church documents because they reinforce unpopular ideas found that this one was rather exciting and revelatory. Some found its length daunting. It is 45,000 words. One called it sprawling. Another simply said it's verbose. But let me mention 3 objections that were made, and together with some ways in which they might be replied to. The first is that the document is anti-scientific, anti-technological, anti-progressive. In some, it's anti-modernist. The second objection is that it's not genuinely a teaching document. And the third is that it's open to empirical criticisms. So the first one, that it's anti-modernist, anti-scientific, etc. John Paul II denounced the culture of death, and Benedict XVI spoke of the dictatorship of relativism, but both made it clear that they intended their criticisms as necessary to restore the religious and moral basis for modernity's positive achievements. But it is claimed in Laudato Si, Francis circles back to an older, more adversarial view of modernity that was found in the 19th century church thinking, in particular when he says that the scientific and experimental method is part of the problem, that technology seeks a lordship over all, absorbing everything into its ironclad logic. Well, that might be replied to in this way, that this isn't anti-modernism, for Laudato Si combines a critique of contemporary post-industrial culture with an admiration not only for advances in the fields of medicine, engineering and communications, but also for the beauty of a modern aircraft and of a skyscraper. A second criticism, that it's not genuinely a teaching document, goes like this. When modern encyclicals combine vigorous criticisms of modernity with affirmation and encouragement of those aspects that promote human dignity, they offer guiding principles for social engagement, which are often derived from natural law reasoning that applies to believers and non-believers alike. Though Laudato Si seeks to continue this tradition, it fails to do so because there are no clearly articulated principles guiding the analysis of the ecological and social crises precipitated by global capitalism. And examples are given, for instance, if global warming precipitates an unprecedented global crisis, then global action of an unprecedented scale and scope may be necessary. Francis says one plan for the whole world, but such an endeavour begs for analysis in terms of the classical notions of solidarity and subsidiarity. And another example, the same goes for the discussion of the common or universal destination of goods. This key principle of Catholic social doctrine teaches that our productive activity is finally ordained by God to serve the common good. This places an important limit on the right to private property. Well, given the strong language used by Francis, one would expect reflection on the degree to which governing authorities can justly override individual property rights to address the crisis, and on how to prevent those rights from being extinguished in the process. But no such reasoning from these principles is found in the encyclical. Well, I think one might reply to that using what Ross Douthat of the New York Times thought of the document. He argues that what distinguishes what Francis has to say on this subject from what his two immediate predecessors had to say is its tone, its pungency, its sweep, its apocalyptic flavour. Francis condemns both those on the left who put their faith in the technological paradigm and those of the right who put their faith in the genius of the market. The tone, that of a catastrophist who argues that we are all on our way to disaster, may in fact be its strength. And a third and final criticism from me, that Francis doesn't grapple sufficiently with the evidence that the global poor have become steadily less poor under precisely the conditions he decries. He doesn't resolve questions related to population growth, and he doesn't make a convincing case that climate change will make the world unsustainable. And in reply, well, it's true that the document combines philosophical claims, theological claims, moral claims, with empirical claims about the causes of pollution and loss of diversity in nature and global inequalities, etc. But Francis also points out that on many of these concrete questions, the Church has no reason to offer a definitive opinion. She knows that honest debate must be encouraged among experts while respecting divergent views. And so, to conclude, there's a chapter in this book that I'm holding up called Food Crash, written by Felix von Lohenstein, the farmer appointed by Francis to the Pontifical Academy for Life, which is headed, "What makes us sick makes others hungry." The thesis is that if we were to eat in a way that was good for our health, there would also be enough for those who had too little to eat today. Now, the argument in the book is complex. Connections must be made between how soil is nourished or depleted, why non-economic criteria should be included in world trade agreements, how patent and tax laws should be rethought, why organic farming needs to develop just as much sophistication as has conventional farming. That said, Felix von Lohenstein sets out a range of ways in which we non-specialists can evaluate solutions advanced in debates that rely on technical arguments. For instance, about the wisdom of setting aside productive arable land for the growing of biofuels, about why speaking truthfully about ecology requires internalizing the external costs of our goods and service. And Felix puts forward a set of principles according to which we can assess what counts as good farming, the principles of health and ecology and fairness and care. Well, Laudato Si renews our attention to a question raised in 2006 by the New Zealand bishops. They said, what is the meaning of "thou shalt not kill" if 20% of the world's population consumes resources at a rate that robs the poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive? But let me leave the last word to Felix von Lohenstein. He says, I rarely say the Our Father without being struck by the fact that the prayer for bread is immediately followed by the prayer for our sins to be forgiven. I hope that this encyclical makes us recognize the sin we commit against our fellow human beings' bread through our use of our possessions and proves to be a source from which we can find the energy to make real change.
Thanks very much, Bernadette. That was bracing and I think really addressed a document from Pope Francis' Pontificate that perhaps was one example, I think, of Pope Francis saying something which connected moral and social teaching and also saying something which caused a little bit of controversy. So we might even come back to that in Q&A. But I'm going to pass now to Natasha Michael, who's going to be the final speaker to address us today. Thanks very much, Natasha.
Thank you, Xavier. I might start by saying I'm not a moral theologian or a philosopher. I'm a clinician, and therefore I will speak within my capacity. And I will start really by maybe trying to summarize the document, Dignitas Infinita, in lay people's language as such, because I found it a useful document to read as somebody who really comes from laity. And I started by simply asking myself the question, what does the word dignity mean? And how was the term Dignitas Infinita coined? So dignity is really the right to be valued, respected, to be made worthy or honor, or just for our individual presence. The term Infinita really arose out of Pope John Paul II, affirming in a meeting of people living with various disabilities and limitations. And what Pope John Paul II was really saying is that dignity transcends all outward appearances in specific aspects of people's lives. It was noteworthy for me to realize that it took 5 years for the document to be completed, commencing in 2019, undergoing many rewrites. and completion occurring in February of 2024. The 5-year course of these text preparations helps us understand that the document that sits before us reflects the gravity and the centrality of the theme of dignity in Christian teaching and thought. And I think Pope Francis really brought that to the forefront. So in using this term Dignitas Infinita, we recognize that each human person possesses infinite dignity. It's grounded by our very being, and this dignity prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, situation that we encounter. And this principle underlies the primacy of human persons and the protection of human rights. And I'll share some slides with you moving forward as I progress with my talk. And this connection that Pope Francis made of the protection of human rights was really in doing so, affirmed the authority of the document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was issued by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. He affirmed that the wellspring of human dignity and fraternity in the gospel of Jesus Christ, but even human reason can arrive at this conviction through reflection and dialogue, since the dignity of others is to be respected in all circumstances, not because their dignity is something that we have invented or imagined, but because we as humans possess an intrinsic worth that is superior to that of material objects and contingent situations. The challenge with the term dignity in the modern era is the risk of lending itself to various interpretations and ambiguities, contradictions that lead us to wonder whether there is equal dignity in all human beings, and do we truly recognize, respect, protect, and promote it in every situation. What was revealing to me was Dignitas Infinita makes fourfold distinctions to the concept of dignity: ontological dignity, moral dignity, social dignity, and I was pleased to see existential dignity. And I might just make some brief points about each of these. An ontological dignity belongs to each of us simply because we exist. It is willed, created, and loved, and because we are willed, created, and loved by God, it's indelible, and it remains valid beyond any circumstances in which we might find ourselves within. The real challenge for us in this time is the challenge of moral dignity, which is the choice of how we choose to exercise our freedom, both in our professional lives and in our personal lives, through the choices we make. While we are endowed with a conscience, we can always act against our conscience, and in doing so, we may behave in ways that are not dignified. And when I think of a clinician, when we use the term an undignified state, it might be a state in which we care, a situation we pose to a particular person, or a clinical situation that might arise that might not have been acceptable or assumed by an individual. However, this possibility always exists for us in the choice that we make with human freedoms, and history has illustrated how we as individuals, as societies, when exercising freedom against the law of love, can commit terrible, profound acts of evil against each other. And in doing so, we lose any trace of humanity and dignity. And this is when the present distinctions helps us discern between moral dignity that is a de facto that can be lost and ontological dignity that can never be annulled. The third form of dignity as such, or distinction of dignity, that is discussed in the encyclical of social dignity. And we refer to this in the quality of a person's living conditions or social circumstances. And I think Catholic organizations, I'm privileged to work with Villa Maria as a board director. I'm privileged to work in a hospice where we maintain facilities and tones of care to ensure that we maintain social dignities for those that we care for. Our Catholic social teaching pays particularly importance to the concept of social dignity. The many good works of not-for-profit groups such as Caritas Australia, St. Vincent de Paul are great examples of social dignity. But in cases of extreme poverty, where individuals may not even have what is minimally necessary to live according to ontological dignity? How do we maintain social dignity? The final form of dignity, or distinction of dignity that's discussed, is that of existential dignity, which is increasingly discussed now in this context of voluntary assisted dying, end of life, and even start of life issues. The risk with existential dignity is that it becomes a subjective view about what is a dignified life and what is not. We make individual judgments of one's personal circumstances, where people may appear to lack nothing essential for life, but for various reasons may struggle to live with peace, joy, hope, in the presence of serious illness, violent environments, pathological addictions. These distinctions of dignity remind us of the inalienable value of the ontological dignity that is rooted in the very being of the human person in all circumstances. The Church proclaims and promotes and guarantees human dignity. And it does so really by reminding us that we are made really in the image, the indelible image and likeness of God, that Christ elevates human dignity, and we should live lives that are of vocation to of dignity. I thought I might end by sharing a few slides with you about the challenges I might face in my work situation. Can everybody see this? Xavier? Can you see this?
Yeah, I can see it. Yes, yeah.
Right. The concept of dignity really arose in the modern hospice, or the ancient hospice time, really through the care of the sick, the elderly, and in the early days of the pilgrims, those that were vulnerable and destitute, and a recognition from the ancient orders or religious groups about the need for care, and subsequently in modern time, through the work of a staunch Anglican, Cecily Son, recognized that the dying mattered regardless of who they were and to the last moments of their life. My palliative care physician has taken me around the world, from the west of Ireland right to Australia through Singapore. And these are some of the patients that I've cared for. This elderly man was an elderly farmer who was in a hospice in Limerick for many years, or for many months when I cared for him, and he would spend whole day staring outside of his window, his mood getting lower and more despondent, and all I had to do was move his bed to the edge of the window where he could count the cattle in front of the house. And when I said to him, "Pat, I'd love to take a photograph of you," what Pat did was he went into his wardrobe and he took out the only piece of clothing that he had at that time, which was a dark suit, and he put it on. Really, to me, in that little moment, and you can see the amount of weight that he had lost, a simple act of, "Pat, can I take a photograph of you?" Transformed this minute or time, short period of time of this man's life. This was the second patient I cared for who died, and his wife, after his death, slept with his corpse in the bed until the undertakers arrived the following morning. What I failed to recognize as a young clinician really was the dignity that was present in their marriage of 60 years of being together. And that in itself provided a source of comfort and love and a sense of who they were as individuals and a couple in union with each other. As a palliative care physician, I see some very unpleasant things, particularly so now that I work in the regional areas. And one might ask, where is the dignity for all of these people? Is it possible to have ontological dignity, social dignity, existential dignity, when one lives in this state of being, this level of suffering? Dignity was provided for all of these individuals really simply through fraternity. This man in Broken Hill had a niece that visited him daily, bringing food that he heated in a microwave oven, 5 nurses that tended to his wounds. This man was not in the least bit troubled by the large mass that covered the side of his face and his eyes, because he had a wonderful family, 3 generations that came in and out of the hospital ward. And these were in public hospitals, not necessarily in Catholic or faith-based organizations. This was a lady who had a friend when I was at Cabrini who attended every appointment with her. She had 2 sons who had mental health issues and couldn't manage on their own. And yet fraternity, simple fraternity, friendships between each other allowed for the maintenance, care, and dignity. This was a young boy with Down syndrome. Despite his disabilities, he was so loved in the time that he spent with us in the hospice. He developed extraordinary bonds with the young doctors that cared for him. They gave him dignity, and I think he gave them a sense of dignity and worth in the care that they provided for him. Existential dignity, existential loss or fear, anxiety, pointlessness, hopelessness, a loss of control. They're more difficult things to address and be attentive to in the healthcare sector, and the work that we do in research with Professor Kisane, myself, and a group of us try to understand the link between people's desire for death, the sense, loss of worth, the loss of existential dignity, and more importantly, we try to reflect on how we try to restore dignity. Just want to take you back to the concept of fraternity that Pope Francis speaks of in Fratelli Tutti. This is the work we have been doing with Villa Maria, visiting hospices across the world or centers across the world so we can gain ideas, develop sense of cooperations and support for each other. Julian and Sonia Smart out in Singapore, which is where I go to teach regularly. So in health particularly, we remember that every patient walks into a hospital vulnerable. The restoration of dignity depends on many things. It depends on the documents or the wordings that are in Laudato Si. This is the hospice that I currently work in out in the regions. A beautiful hospice, a wonderful environment where families get to roll their beds out and patients are cared for out in the open. And I thought I couldn't end about speaking about dignity and the document without making reference to the Jubilee year. And a group of us this year visited Rome with the Archbishop in Melbourne, the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi. And exactly as you alluded to, Bernadette, a very humbling time. And if anybody's ever been to Assisi, you can't but be brought to remember really that what's asked of us as Christians, and I think exemplified by Pope Francis, was the simplicity of St. Francis, the littleness of groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor. And Michael would recognize this. This is the Cardinal Hume Centre that is in the expensive, wealthy borough of Westminster, but yet care for the most destitute, poor, and underprivileged in society. So I might simply end by saying that the Church believes and affirms all of us as human beings, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and we are recreated, who recreated in the Son and who became man, was crucified and rose again. He was called to grow under the action of the Holy Spirit, to reflect the glory of the Father and that same image, and to share in eternal life. So therefore, we show the dignity of human persons in all of its fullness, really, through our reflections of God, Christ, and how we lived both as God as man. So I'm not a theologian. I don't have the language that Bernadette and Michael have, but I certainly have learned a lot really for preparing for this presentation, Xavier, and I'll let it head back to you now.
Thanks very much, Natasha. That was a very humane presentation. I think a very helpful reflection on how Pope Francis's writings can help us think about caring for people, particularly at the end of life. So I'm very grateful for that. So we have about 12 minutes for questions, and I might start by just reading a question from an audience member, from Michael Cook. that it is often said that the Pope had no right to pontificate on climate change, to adopt a particular approach toward global warming. Is this objection correct? I don't know if anyone wants to comment on this, Bernadette or Michael, perhaps.
I'd be happy to kick off and then give Michael a go. Thank you, Michael Cook, for that question. Notice that the word to pontificate is a pejorative term. But I guess the only person with whom it isn't pejorative is a pope. He gets to pontificate. And look, I think that in Laudato Si, you see that he said, look, the church, and he had no special authority on empirical questions. But that said, he did set out a whole lot of factual scenarios about rising temperatures and rising sea levels and polluted oceans, with which it is, for me, hard to reject as factually incorrect. But Michael reminded us that the Pope heroically tried to synthesize moral teaching with social teaching, and of course he will be open to objections of theological kinds, of moral kinds, and of empirical kinds, but good for him for having a go. I'll leave it to Michael now.
Thanks, Bernadette. I heartily agree with what you say. I'll just add that I think quite often when people criticize the Pope for what they perceive as stepping into an arena that he's not supposed to, I mean, there's an underlying objection, which is they themselves, in this case in relation to climate change, perhaps aren't quite fully on board with or have some skepticism towards the climate change science. Now, within the scientific community, I'm sure that skepticism and debate is always important, but where the church's moral and social mission is concerned, well, the church first of all understands, as all of us should, that science is never 100% objective. There are always biases and experiments. There are questions of what has been proved or disproved definitively. The church cannot wait for something to be proven with absolute 100% certainty in science before she finally makes a prudential teaching about what we ought to do morally. So I think that on the basis of what the church sees as the best science, not perfect, but a very good guide to what is empirically the case, the church can and should make moral and prudential judgments. And sometimes, things will align and show quite clearly that this is, something morally problematic.
Great. So I'd just like to encourage members of the audience to send through your questions. If you have any questions arising from anything discussed in this set of presentations, or any other burning questions which you've been thinking about the last few days since Pope Francis passed away. I mean, I had a question just with respect to this idea that in some cases, I think people faulted Pope Francis for what was said to be a lack of clarity on certain matters. I mean, personally, I think on bioethical questions, often there was, far from a lack of clarity, there was kind of like a sort of crystal clear assertiveness, to the point of being, in the case of Dignitas Infinita, like a little bit clunky at times, I would say. Like, I think some of the ways in which positions were articulated in Dignitas Infinita, it had the impression that the document, like one got the impression that that document had been edited about 100 times. And for those of you who've ever collaborated on a co-authored academic article, you kind of know what I mean when the end product ends up being this kind of like jumble of contributions from different people, which may be difficult to read as a coherent argument. So I don't know if Michael, Natasha, or Bernadette, if any of you had any thoughts on that specific topic, like whether you felt that in some cases Pope Francis could have been clearer on some things, or whether you felt that that's probably not a fair criticism.
I think I might start, Xavier, as a simple lay person. I think what Pope Francis taught us really was, how you translate what might be in these complex writings into our actions. For the ordinary person who may not understand the language of some of these encyclicals, I think Pope Francis was loved, respected, because of the way he conducted himself and the example that he provided to us in the way he lived, the way he served. I did not find these clunky documents. For me, as I read through them, the challenge always was to ask myself, now, how do I translate this to my workplace? How do I translate this to what I see at work? How do I deal with the drug addict? And I've got lots of them now who's coming into a hospice. And there's a hospital policy that says you're not allowed to have somebody who's actively taking drugs in your palliative care unit, and yet that patient's dying. How do I maintain, the dignity of that person, keep my staff safe, work with senior staff, and fundamentally remembering that at the end of the bed, there is somebody whose life has worth, his life has purpose and meaning, regardless of all of the other challenges that's posed. So I think that's the sort of translation that many of us need to start to think about.
So if I may, I'll add my, unless Bernadette wants to speak.
No, Michael.
Thank you. Sorry. I'll just what I'd say is that when it comes to questioning the Pope, the late Pope's clarity or supposedly lack of clarity, it really is important to get to the bottom of where that supposed lack of clarity, where does it exist in? Because I think so much of that debate, of those criticisms of the Pope, for many people came from a place of suspicion, of deep-seated suspicion and hostility even to the Pope, thinking he is some kind of, I won't repeat any language used on social media about the Pope, but, he's trying to change church teaching and all that. Whereas I think so often where there were perceived difficulties in clarity, so much of it comes from that difficulty, which is not, is not a mechanical process of applying moral principles to the messiness of reality. And Pope Francis, I think, often used that term, the messiness of reality. So we've got to be clear, we've got to let cooler heads prevail and just dispassionately analyze if there's a lack of clarity. What are the circumstances that are so difficult to define that is leading to this lack of clarity? Now, I do agree. Now, I do think that for the church, the new Pope, whoever he will be, and the church moving forward, Pope Francis has done something that is difficult, and the church will need to continually think and rethink how she should best teach prudential teachings and judgments, because you can't specify every single circumstance. And yet when the Pope says something, it holds so much weight for people across a wide range of circumstances. There is a challenge, but we've got to try. We can't just say it's too difficult, we stick to abstract, absolute principles.
Xavier, I would love to go on to Joe McCarthy's question. Does anyone wish to comment on the place of gesture as a teaching tool? They say, preach, and if you must, use words. And I was delighted that Michael referred to that extraordinary image of the Pope embracing the man with boils all over his entire body. And a couple of others I've heard recently on a podcast. I now can't remember who they were, for both of them. One was Father James Martin, SJ, and the other one was Ross Stafford of the New York Times, very different styles of being Catholic. It was very interesting that for both of them, the most striking image was not the washing of the feet of the prisoners, which was so beautiful, but the embrace of the man with those terrible boils. So good for you, Joe. Exactly. Preach, and if you must, use words.
Okay, so thanks very much, Bernadette. So we've got a few questions which I might see if we can get through very quickly because we've just got 3 minutes literally left. So just question from Carlo to Decore is, could one of the speakers discuss the legacy of Pope Francis in raising environmental conscience in the world, and to what extent this will inform public discourse and debate? Any brief 1 or 2 sentence comments on that?
Well, look, I just make one comment that if you think of what Vice President Al Gore said about environmental issues, which was striking for a very short time, its influence absolutely washed out by the effect of that particular Laudato Si on our consciousness of this social responsibility we have to connect respect for the human individual with an acknowledgement of the connection with the entire universe.
Very interesting, yeah. From Ruth Moraes, do any of the presenters wish to comment on the document Life is Always a Good, recently published by the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life? Michael, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, if you or we did actually briefly look at that here at the Plunkett Centre. I know Adam Weslanoff, our project officer, and myself, we took a brief look over it, and we'll be revisiting in due course. So maybe we can hold that one over to a future webinar, I suppose. But it seemed like basically that document was providing a pastoral kind of like talking about a pastoral approach to engaging the culture, engaging the faithful of the church, as well as the broader culture and broader society on life issues, and it had some really helpful suggestions. So I mean, that's all I could say about that for the moment. Got a question now from or comment from Stephen Parnas. The idea that the documents published under papal authority would be encountered by a relatively small audience, millions. His actions, the example cited by Xavier at the beginning, were seen and noted by billions. So I think this is just going back to the value of gestures and the kind of educative power of those gestures of Pope Francis in shaping a consciousness of what the obligations of Catholics and all human beings are. Like, I don't know if anyone wants to comment further on that.
Perhaps I'll just say that Pope Francis was perhaps the first pope, genuinely the first pope of the Instagram era. I know Instagram existed when Pope Benedict was pope, but it really was under Pope Francis' pontificate that we were, receiving images and hearing videos, listening to videos of the Pope from our smartphones, pretty much from anywhere in the world with an internet connection. So I think that's very important to keep in mind for the future of the Church and how future popes make use of what the Vatican still call new technologies.
That's great. Yeah, no, really nice note to finish on, I think. And thanks very much, Stephen, for that comment. Stephen Parnas is also a clinical fellow at the Plunkett Centre, an honorary clinical fellow. So I'm very grateful for that comment. And I would just like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, but especially our speakers for their presentations and responses to questions. I think this was a very good opportunity to reflect on Pope Francis's bioethical writings, as well as his example, I think, his kind of personal example of what it means to acknowledge the dignity of human life in practice, in concrete circumstances. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that today, so we can kind of pat ourselves on the back. We will probably have a new Pope in by the time of our next Plunkett webinar, at least. So I think it'll be interesting to reflect in due course on what that new Pope will have to say on bioethics and some of the challenges that are yet to be addressed. But I'd just like to thank again everyone for joining us, and encourage you all to sign up to our mailing list if you haven't already. And we'll definitely keep you all posted about future Plunkett events, and we'll wish you a good evening at this point.